Welcome back to Magic, Witchcraft, and Religion. I'm your instructor, Professor Leitner, and today we are going to be talking about magic. What is magic? I touched on this briefly in some of our earlier lectures, but today we'll go into a little more depth. So, magic, or studying magic, involves a few interesting questions that studying other things maybe don't. For one thing, our first reaction when we talk about magic is, well, is it real? But the question isn't really, is it real, but who is it real for? Are we talking about the real effects or the real causes? And it's not about proving or disproving people's beliefs. In other words, anthropologists are trying to understand people's beliefs and their interpretations of events on their own terms. We want to know how people think about the world, experience the world, and view the world. So, our interest in magic is in understanding the consequences of magical beliefs and actions for a range of different cultural effects. How do they affect social organization? How do they affect political action, economic activity, personal meaning, and much, much more? One thing we need to do is differentiate between religion and magic. Magic is the direct manipulation of the supernatural by an actor. That is, it is directly doing things that will influence supernatural forces or supernatural beings. Religion, on the other hand, it might involve some direct manipulation, but it oftentimes involves the indirect manipulation of the supernatural through some sort of specialist who's an intermediary. It could be a shaman, a priest, something like that. But more specifically, while magic is involved in specific acts that directly affect the supernatural, religion becomes a generalized system of not just beliefs, but also the symbols, the rituals, the myths about both the natural and the supernatural world. Anthropologists' definitions and attitudes about magic have changed greatly over the years. In general, we've always agreed that magic is the art of influencing people and events using the supernatural. In the 19th and 20th century, early anthropologists considered magic the antithesis of rationalism. Remember the social evolutionists, they really believed that societies had to go through these specific stages, and they really saw rationalism as sort of the peak of human development. And that magic would be something very quote unquote primitive. Therefore, they believed primitive people's beliefs were irrational. They believed in magic. They didn't understand logical thinking. And in some cases, they even questioned whether indigenous peoples were capable of rational thought. We know that's ridiculous now, but that is the way they thought about it. In return, anthropologists' beliefs were considered rational. We believe in science. We are rational. We are more advanced. By the mid 20th century, anthropologists, largely influenced by Franz Boas's work, had begun to recognize that there were not fundamental biological or cognitive differences between indigenous people and Western European Euro American folk. Instead, they began to see magic as rational thought based on incorrect premises. They saw it as inherently political in nature. That is, you are doing things and you are not just influencing the supernatural, but you're influencing the people around you as well. And they believed that all humans had rational capacities and a scientific attitude. Contemporary anthropologists, well, not thinking that indigenous people are any less rational than us, are not really concerned about this question of rationality or not. Instead, we're questioning a lot of the assumptions we bring to the study of magic or have brought to it over the past 100 years or so. For instance, they question the distinction between the natural and the supernatural. Not everybody makes a clear cut distinction between these two realms. So, using it as an analytical tool may have its limits. And more, we're emphasizing what people do with their magic rather than questioning whether magic is real or whether they are being rational. E.B. Tyler, famous unilineal evolutionist, felt that magic is, quote, the most pernicious delusion that has ever vexed mankind. You can guess his attitude, right? Well, despite that, he also suggested that perhaps the reason that we see magic everywhere can be explained by the fact that perhaps we all share an analogical consciousness, that is, we think by analogy, and associating that analogical consciousness with practical behavior tends to be what magic does. In other words, we did the ceremony, then it rained, the ceremony worked. Magic, he also noticed, benefits from a flexible use of evidence. Failure in magic is easily attributable to errors in practice or by the influence of rivals who don't want you to succeed. There are all sorts of ways that things can go wrong to make the ritual not work, none of which are that magic doesn't exist. Fraser held that magic was spurious science hiding behind bastard art. Obviously, he didn't have a great deal of respect for it either. He felt that while science rests on faith in the uniformity of nature and the unidirectional causality of the world, magic rests on mistaken ideas about causes and effects. He also felt that magic follows what he called the law of sympathy. That is, there's an apparent association or agreement between things. This he further divided into a law of similarity, like produces like, and a law of contagion. Things that were once connected can still influence each other. Fraser's law of similarity can also be called homeopathic magic. It works through imitation or correspondence. Imitation means that representations are used to affect particular people and their environments. Think of effigies or like these poppets that were found in Britain. These poppets would generally be used when you wanted to cast spells on a particular person, and the poppet would stand in for that person. They don't have to be effigies and puppets, they can be images, they can also be the behavior or movements of certain things. You can sometimes evoke the power of particular animals by trying to move like them in a ceremony. Correspondence refers to the fact that you are going to influence one thing based on the perceived similarity or resemblance it has to something else. Red fruits oftentimes stand in for things like menstrual blood. Phallic-shaped roots are often used to treat things like male impotence, and yellow, in other words, bile-colored plants are often used for stomach ailments, thus looking like bile or vomit. The law of contagion, or contagious magic, holds that things that have been in contact continue to have an influence at a distance. This can be the nails, the hair, the teeth, or the belongings of a person or an animal. They can be meaningful items. It is one way that sometimes people believe disease is caused through the transference of disease from an object to a person. Also, This is why people believe that souvenirs and relics hold the power of the person they are from. Now, in the 1930s and 1940s, as Sigmund Freud's writings started being translated into English and becoming more popular in the United States, it had an effect on anthropology as well. There were attempts to try and understand magic through psychology. Robert Louis disagreed with Tyler's distinction between the supernatural and natural, and of course didn't agree with Fraser's evolutionary theory. And he said that the distinction is between the natural and the supernatural is foreign to primitive thought, quote unquote. Ruth Benedict saw magic as a kind of wish fulfillment. She was heavily influenced by Freud and believed that uh, every human being has a capacity to reason by analogy, and that lies at the root of magic. Bronislaw Malinowski saw magic as inherently practical in nature. He did not want to make a sharp distinction between so-called primitive magic and so-called civilized science and religion. He held that there were no societies that did not have all three, in the form of magic, in the form of religion, and in the form of some type of scientific sensibility. He believed that even so-called primitive people have a body of traditional knowledge that gives them a working understanding of the natural world, and they get it through observation and experimentation. He calls this a scientific attitude. Now, he also insisted that magic has different functions from those other two things. It has a psychological and social utility. It brings the group together and keeps it together and helps us deal with both personal and group stress. It helps us cope with the unpredictable and uncontrollable nature of life. It gives us a way to mediate our emotional responses. And what he found is that magical rituals tended to flourish in dangerous activities. They were more elaborate and more frequent in things like hunting, fishing, war, and love. Yes, love can be dangerous. He also saw that magic is political. It was a way of organizing practical actions for people who lack authoritative control to force people to do things. The canoe building that was required for the Kula exchanges in the Trobriand Islands required a great deal of labor, and the magical rituals were a way of requiring people to come together in large groups to actually accomplish this. George Gmelch took Malinowski's ideas and applied them to American baseball, right? He wanted to look at how baseball players deal with the uncertainty of the sport. Baseball is an unusual sport in the fact that if you are missing 7 out of 10 at bats and striking out, you're actually doing really, really well. So having a 30% average or 300 is considered amazing in baseball. And so it's a highly unpredictable game. He found that the players tended to ritualize any activity that appeared to be linked to their good performance, usually in terms of timing. That could be wearing a particular piece of lucky clothing or abstaining from either alcohol or cigarettes or sex or other things before games, having particular ways that they had to lace up their shoes. It also gave them a sense of confidence and control, which frankly probably affected their performance. Remember, the best hitters only hit about 30% of the time. He also noted the ways in which that baseball itself tended to symbolize a number of key myths about American culture that the players were reenacting. Remember, the role of the individual is very important, right? there's a single batter at any one time, but going up against a large group of people out in the field who they are batting against. Um, and the way that baseball stadiums are laid out is while the rules for the infield are quite strict, the actual distance of the outfield is completely unregulated, right? And this is why some ballparks you have a much easier time hitting home runs than others. And this, he said, sort of provides a reflection of the optimism that Americans have for the future. He was writing this quite a while ago. I think maybe some of our optimism has changed since then. Finally, I should at least mention Wicca. Tanya Luhrmann is an anthropologist who studied modern witches, Wiccans, neo-pagans, pagans, and the like, in Cambridge in the UK. She found that when practitioners were explaining their beliefs to people, they tended to have different rationalizations for the validity of their beliefs and rituals. For some, it was some things are inexplicable by orthodox science, but can still be shown to be empirically true. That is, you may not be able to explain it with science, but I saw the relationship between cause and effect. Other people saw that there were separate realities that were governed by different laws. Magic is working in a parallel reality that intersects with this one in some places. Others felt that magically was simply a different way of knowing the world, a different way of looking at the world around us. And finally, some thought that the experiences were subjectively important whether or not they were empirically real. In other words, subjective reality has importance too. So, some final thoughts. Magic is practical by nature. That is what magic does. It is a way of influencing the world and getting things done by enrolling supernatural agents and having effect on the natural and supernatural worlds. It's also a political act when it's done in groups. It brings people together and you can do things. Magic is also a way of affecting the emotional, spiritual, and the psychological self, and it permeates our everyday life. There are many ways to understand magic. We can talk about magic in terms of the subject of the magic, the group that is part of it, how outsiders fit in. We can talk about economic, social, and political aspects. We can talk about emotional, psychological, and health aspects. We can also talk about the way magic intersects with power, colonialism, and politics. Magic is a pretty wide open field for understanding human activity, in part because it's a universal human thing. We all do it. Um, so that's it for now. I hope you all have a great week, and I'll see you soon.